The radio crackled to life in Detective Ryan Blake's patrol car as he finished his coffee. Unit 47, we have a suspicious person report on Maple Street. Black female, mid-50s, tampering with a luxury vehicle. Caller says she doesn't belong in the neighborhood. Ryan set down his cup and started the engine. He'd been working this beat for 8 years and he knew the area well. Maple Street was where the city's elite lived. Doctors, lawyers, business owners. The houses had perfectly manicured lawns and driveways filled with expensive cars. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect to find trouble. But lately there had been reports of car thefts in nearby areas. As he turned onto Maple Street, Ryan spotted her immediately. A well-dressed black woman stood beside a gleaming silver BMW, leaning into the driver's side. She wore a navy blue suit that looked expensive, and her hair was styled professionally. But something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The car was parked in front of one of the biggest houses on the street, and the woman kept looking around as if she was worried about being seen. Ryan pulled his patrol car to the curb and got out. His hand instinctively moved closer to his belt as he approached. Years of police work had taught him to be cautious, especially when dealing with potential theft cases. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the authority that came with his badge. "I need to speak with you." The woman straightened up and turned to face him. She was older than he'd initially thought, probably in her early 50s with kind eyes and a calm expression. But Ryan had learned not to judge people by their appearance. Some of the smoothest criminals he'd encountered looked like they wouldn't hurt a fly. "Good afternoon, officer," she said politely. Her voice was educated, refined. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I received a call about someone tampering with this vehicle," Ryan said, gesturing toward the BMW. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" The woman's eyebrows raised slightly, and for just a moment Ryan thought he saw a flash of something in her eyes. Surprise, annoyance, but her voice remained steady. "I was retrieving my briefcase from my car," she explained. "I forgot it this morning when I left for work." Ryan looked at the BMW again. It was a recent model, probably worth more than he made in 2 years. The license plate was local, but that didn't mean much. "Car thieves were getting smarter these days. This is your car?" he asked, pulling out his notepad. "Yes, it is. I'm going to need to see some identification and the vehicle registration." The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a wallet. She handed him a driver's license without saying a word. Ryan studied it carefully. The name read Angela Washington, and the address matched the house they were standing in front of. But something still felt off to him. "And the registration?" he asked. "It should be in the glove compartment," Angela said. "May I retrieve it?" Ryan nodded but stayed close as she leaned into the car. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if she understood that any quick movements might be misinterpreted. When she handed him the registration, Ryan compared the information to her license. Everything seemed to match, but he'd seen fake documents before. "Mrs. Washington," he said, still studying the papers. "You live at this address?" "Yes, I do. What do you do for work?" Angela paused for a moment, and Ryan noticed her jaw tighten slightly. "I work for the federal government." That was vague, Ryan thought. Most people were more specific about their jobs. "What kind of work?" "Legal work," she said simply. Ryan wasn't satisfied with her answers. Something about her demeanor suggested she was hiding something. Maybe she was a skilled con artist who knew how to forge documents. Maybe she'd stolen the car and was trying to talk her way out of it. He'd seen it all before. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to be more specific," he said, his tone becoming firmer. "And I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Angela's expression changed. The politeness remained, but there was steel in her voice now. "Officer, I've provided you with my identification and registration. Both clearly show that this is my car and my home. What exactly is the problem here?" Ryan felt his patience wearing thin. In his experience, innocent people didn't get defensive when questioned by police. They cooperated fully, understanding that officers were just doing their jobs. "The problem, ma'am, is that someone called in a report of a suspicious person, and right now you're not giving me straight answers about who you are or what you're doing here." "I've told you exactly who I am and what I'm doing," Angela replied. "I live here. This is my car. I was getting my briefcase. I'm not sure what more you need to know." Ryan studied her face, looking for signs of deception. She maintained eye contact, which was either a sign of honesty or excellent training in lying. Her hands were steady, her breathing normal, but he'd learned not to trust appearances. Look, he said, trying a different approach. I'm sure you can understand my position here. We've had reports of car thefts in this area. Someone calls in a suspicious person report and I have to check it out. If you're really who you say you are, then we can clear this up quickly. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Angela asked. Well, for starters, you could tell me exactly where you work. Not just the federal government or legal work. Give me specifics. Angela was quiet for a long moment. Ryan could see her weighing her options, and that made him even more suspicious. Innocent people didn't need time to think about where they worked. I work at the federal courthouse downtown, she finally said. Doing what? Another pause. I'd prefer not to discuss the details of my work. That was it. Ryan had heard enough evasive answers. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station so we can sort this out properly. Am I under arrest? Angela asked. You're being detained for questioning regarding a possible vehicle theft. Angela's composure finally cracked just slightly. Officer, this is ridiculous. I've shown you my identification. I've shown you the registration. What more do you want? I want the truth, Ryan said. And I want you to stop playing games with me. As he spoke, Ryan noticed a few neighbors had come out to watch the scene unfold. An elderly white man across the street stood on his porch, shaking his head. A woman walking her dog had stopped to stare. Ryan felt the weight of their attention, and it only reinforced his belief that he was doing the right thing. These people knew their neighborhood, and they'd called him for a reason. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Ryan instructed. Angela looked at him in disbelief. You're handcuffing me? For what? For questioning in connection with a possible vehicle theft. You have the right to remain silent. As Ryan began reading her rights, Angela closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned disappointment that made Ryan wonder, just for a moment, if he was making a mistake. But he pushed that thought away. He was a good cop, and good cops followed their instincts. And his instincts told him that Angela Washington wasn't telling him the whole truth. The police station felt colder than usual as Detective Blake led Angela through the corridors. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. Other officers looked up from their desks as they passed, some with curiosity, others with the practiced indifference that came with years of seeing people brought in for questioning. Ryan guided Angela into interview room 2. A small windowless space with beige walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look guilty of something. He'd conducted hundreds of interviews in this room over the years, and he knew how to use its oppressive atmosphere to his advantage. Please, have a seat, he said, gesturing to the chair facing away from the door. It was a small psychological trick he'd learned early in his career. Suspects felt more trapped when they couldn't see the exit. Angela sat down carefully, smoothing her skirt and placing her hands on the table. Even in handcuffs, she maintained an air of dignity that Ryan found unsettling. Most people brought in for questioning were nervous, fidgety, or angry. Angela seemed almost patient. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Ryan asked as he settled into the chair across from her. I'd like to make a phone call, Angela said quietly. We'll get to that, Ryan replied, opening his notepad. First, I'd like to clear up a few things about what happened today. What would you like to know? Ryan studied her face again. Up close, under the harsh lights, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the careful way she held herself. She was definitely older than he'd first thought, maybe mid-50s. But age didn't mean innocence. Some of the most successful criminals he'd encountered were people who'd spent decades perfecting their craft. Let's start with the car, he said. You claim it belongs to you. It does belong to me. How long have you owned it? About 3 years. Where did you buy it? Angela paused and Ryan leaned forward slightly. I purchased it from Peterson BMW downtown. You paid cash? No, I financed it through the dealership. Ryan made a note. That would be easy enough to verify if she was telling the truth. And you said you work at the federal courthouse. Well, no, that's correct. What's your job title? Another pause, longer this time. Angela's eyes moved away from his face for just a moment before returning. I'd rather not discuss the specifics of my work until I've spoken with someone. Someone like who? A lawyer? Someone who can verify my employment? Ryan felt his frustration building. Every answer led to more questions, more evasions. In his experience, innocent people were eager to clear their names. They gave detailed answers, provided references, did whatever they could to help the investigation move forward. They didn't sit in interview rooms asking for phone calls and refusing to discuss their jobs. "Look, Mrs. Washington," he said, using a tone he'd perfected over the years. Firm but not aggressive, authoritative but not threatening. "I understand you're probably nervous. Being brought in for questioning isn't pleasant for anyone. But the best thing you can do right now is be completely honest with me. I have been honest with you. Have you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're hiding something." Angela's expression didn't change, but Ryan thought he saw her shoulders tense slightly. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" "I think you stole that car," Ryan said bluntly. "I think you've got fake identification, and I think you were hoping to get away with it before anyone noticed." For the first time since he'd approached her on Maple Street, Angela looked genuinely shocked. Her eyes widened and she leaned back in her chair as if she'd been physically struck. "You think I stole my own car?" she asked. "I think you stole someone else's car and you're pretending it's yours." Angela was quiet for a long moment and Ryan could see her processing what he'd said. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Officer Blake, I want to be very clear about something. I have not stolen anything. That BMW belongs to me. I have owned it for 3 years. I have the insurance documents, the loan paperwork, and the purchase agreement to prove it. If you would like to verify this information, I'm happy to provide you with the contact information for my insurance company and the dealership where I bought it." Ryan made another note. She was either telling the truth or she was the most prepared car thief he'd ever encountered, but something still didn't add up. "If everything you're saying is true," he said, "then why won't you tell me what you do for work?" "Because my work involves sensitive matters that I'm not at liberty to discuss with unauthorized personnel." "Unauthorized personnel?" "I'm a police officer conducting a criminal investigation, and I'm asking for the opportunity to speak with someone who can verify my identity and authorize me to discuss my employment." Ryan had heard similar excuses before. People claimed to work for the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. They said they couldn't discuss their jobs because of national security or classified information. It was usually nonsense, a way to make themselves seem more important or to buy time while they figured out their next lie. "Mrs. Washington, unless you're telling me you're some kind of federal agent, I don't see why you can't simply tell me your job title." Angela looked at him steadily. "I'm not a federal agent, then what's the big secret?" She didn't answer immediately, and Ryan could see her weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "Officer Blake, I understand you're doing your job, and I respect that. But I'm asking you to extend me the same professional courtesy I would extend to you. Allow me to make a phone call so that someone can verify who I am and what I do. Once that's done, I'm confident this misunderstanding can be resolved quickly." Ryan shook his head. "No phone calls until we get some real answers. And right now, all I'm getting from you are vague non-answers and excuses." He stood up and began pacing around the small room, a technique he'd learned to make suspects feel more pressure. "Here's what I think happened today. I think you saw an opportunity to steal a nice car from a wealthy neighborhood. Maybe you've done it before, maybe this was your first time. But you got unlucky because someone spotted you and called it in. That's not what happened. Then tell me what did happen, in detail. No more vague answers about working for the government or sensitive matters. Tell me exactly who you are and what you were doing in that neighborhood." Angela was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Ryan could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the muffled sounds of the police station beyond the interview room door. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Angela Washington. I live at 847 Maple Street. I have lived there for 12 years. I bought that house after my divorce using money from the settlement and my savings. I drive a 2021 BMW that I purchased from Peterson BMW in 2022. I work at the federal courthouse downtown, where I have worked for over 20 years. Ryan stopped pacing and looked at her. "What do you do at the courthouse?" Angela met his eyes. "I can't tell you that without authorization." "Can't or won't?" "Both." Ryan slammed his hand on the table, the sudden noise echoing in the small room. Angela didn't flinch, which surprised him. Most people jumped when he did that. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're sitting in a police station, detained on suspicion of auto theft, and you're still playing games with me." "I'm not playing games. Officer Blake, I'm trying to protect the integrity of my work while also cooperating with your investigation. Cooperating? You call this cooperating? I've answered every question I'm able to answer. I've provided identification and vehicle registration. I've given you the information you need to verify my identity and my ownership of the vehicle. What more can I do? Ryan sat back down and leaned across the table. You can stop lying to me. I haven't lied to you. Then prove it. Tell me exactly what you do at the courthouse. Angela looked at him for a long moment, and Ryan thought he saw something shift in her expression. Not fear exactly, but a kind of sadness that he couldn't quite interpret. Officer Blake, she said quietly, I'm going to ask you one more time. Please allow me to make a phone call. One call, to someone who can verify my identity and clear this up immediately. And I'm going to tell you one more time. Ryan replied, No phone calls until you start being honest with me. Angela nodded slowly as if she'd expected that answer. She folded her hands in her lap and settled back in her chair, and for the first time since he'd brought her in, Ryan got the feeling that she was prepared to wait him out. 2 hours had passed since Angela Washington had been brought into the interview room. Detective Blake had tried every technique he knew, friendly conversation, stern questioning, even leaving her alone for 30 minutes to see if isolation would break her resolve. Nothing worked. She sat calmly, hands folded, occasionally asking for water but never changing her story. Ryan was beginning to feel the eyes of his colleagues. Through the one-way mirror, he'd seen other officers pause to observe the interview. Some looked curious, others concerned. Sergeant Martinez had even knocked on the door once to ask if everything was going okay. This is getting ridiculous, Ryan muttered to himself as he stood outside the interview room, reviewing his notes. Everything she'd told him checked out so far. He'd called Peterson BMW and they confirmed that Angela Washington had indeed purchased a silver BMW in 2022. Her insurance company verified that she was the policyholder. Even her address was exactly as she'd stated, but something still bothered him. Why wouldn't she simply tell him what she did for work? And why did she seem so composed? Most innocent people would be upset, angry, demanding to speak to lawyers or supervisors. Angela Washington sat in that chair like she was waiting for a bus. Ryan pushed open the door to the interview room. Angela looked up at him expectantly. Mrs. Washington, he said, settling back into his chair. I've verified some of your information. The car is registered to you, you did buy it from Peterson BMW, and you do live at the address on your license. Thank you for checking, Angela said simply, but I still can't verify your employment, because you won't tell me what you do. I've explained why I can't discuss that. Ryan leaned forward. Here's the thing I don't understand. If you really work at the federal courthouse, why haven't you asked to speak to a lawyer? Don't you know any attorneys? For the first time in hours, Angela smiled slightly. I know quite a few attorneys, actually. Then why haven't you asked to call one? Because I don't need a lawyer, Officer Blake. I need you to allow me to make one phone call to verify my identity. That's all. Ryan studied her face. There was something about her expression, a confidence that went beyond simple stubbornness. She wasn't fighting him or arguing with him. She was just waiting. Fine, he said finally. One phone call. But I want to hear every word. Angela nodded. Of course. Ryan led her to a phone at a desk just outside the interview room. Several officers looked up from their paperwork as they passed. He could feel their curiosity, their unspoken questions about why this case was taking so long. Angela picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory. Ryan positioned himself where he could hear both sides of the conversation. Federal Courthouse, Judge Washington's chambers. A woman's voice answered. Ryan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Judge, had she said judge? Hello, Patricia, Angela said calmly. This is Judge Washington. I'm calling from the police station on 5th Street. I need you to bring my official identification and judicial credentials immediately. There was a pause on the other end. Judge Washington, are you all right? Why are you at a police station? I'm fine, Patricia. There's been a misunderstanding about my identity. Can you please bring my credentials and ask Captain Torres to come with you? I believe he's still in the building. Of course, Your Honor. We'll be there in 15 minutes. Angela hung up the phone and turned to look at Ryan. The expression on her face wasn't angry or triumphant. If anything, she looked sad. Judge? Ryan managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The Honorable Angela Washington, she said quietly. United States District Judge for the Northern District. I've been on the federal bench for 18 years. The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. A federal judge. He'd arrested and interrogated a federal judge. The room seemed to spin around him, and he had to grab the edge of the desk to steady himself. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "I tried to tell you I worked at the courthouse. You didn't want to listen." Other officers had begun to notice the commotion. Sergeant Martinez approached, concern evident on his face. "Blake? Everything okay over here?" Ryan couldn't find his voice. Angela spoke instead. "Sergeant, I'm Judge Angela Washington from the federal courthouse. Detective Blake arrested me this afternoon on suspicion of stealing my own car. I've been trying to verify my identity for the past 2 hours." Martinez went pale. "Ma'am, There must be some mistake." "Yes," Angela said simply. "There has been." The next 15 minutes passed in a blur. Word spread quickly through the station that they had a federal judge in custody. Officers who had been curious before now stared openly, some whispering among themselves. Ryan found himself surrounded by colleagues asking what had happened, but he couldn't explain it to them because he couldn't explain it to himself. When Patricia Chen, Judge Washington's clerk, arrived with Captain Torres from the courthouse security, the atmosphere in the station shifted dramatically. Patricia was a small woman in her 30s, but she carried herself with the authority that came from working in federal court. Captain Torres was a former police officer himself, and Ryan could see the disappointment in his eyes as he surveyed the scene. "Your Honor," Patricia said, rushing to Angela's side. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, Patricia. Just tired." Patricia turned to address the room, her voice carrying clearly. "This is the Honorable Judge Angela Washington, United States District Judge. She has served on the federal bench for 18 years and has been employed by the federal court system for over 20 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan felt every eye in the room looking at him, judging him, wondering how he could have made such a catastrophic mistake. Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Judge Washington, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for this incident. This should never have happened." Angela removed the handcuffs that Ryan had finally unlocked. She rubbed her wrists where the metal had left marks, but her voice remained calm. "Sergeant, I understand that your officers have a difficult job, but what happened today was more than just a mistake. It was a failure of basic police procedure and human decency." Martinez nodded grimly. "Ma'am, I assure you there will be a full investigation." "I hope so," Angela said. She looked around the room at all the faces staring at her. "Because this kind of thing happens more often than you might think. The difference is that most people don't have Patricia and Captain Torres to call." Ryan finally found his voice. "Judge Washington, I was just following up on a call. Someone reported a suspicious person." Angela looked at him directly for the first time since learning who she was. "Detective Blake, someone called in a report of a black woman standing next to a nice car in a wealthy neighborhood, and instead of approaching the situation with an open mind, you decided I was guilty before you even spoke to me." "That's not... I was just being careful." "Were you? Because careful police work would have involved actually listening to what I was telling you. Careful police work would have meant verifying my information before deciding I was a criminal. Careful police work would have recognized that a woman in professional attire with valid identification and vehicle registration might actually be exactly who she says she is." The truth of her words hung in the air like a weight. Ryan knew she was right, and more importantly, he knew that everyone else in the room knew she was right too. Captain Torres stepped forward. "Judge Washington, would you like us to arrange for transportation back to your vehicle?" "Thank you, Captain, but I think I can manage." Angela gathered her purse and straightened her jacket. Despite everything that had happened, she still looked dignified, professional. "Detective Blake, I want you to think about something. Today you saw a black woman and assumed she was a criminal. You ignored evidence to the contrary, and refused to listen when she tried to tell you who she was. Ask yourself what would have happened if I had been anyone else. Ask yourself what would have happened if I didn't have people who could verify my identity. And ask yourself if that's the kind of police officer you want to be." With that, Judge Angela Washington walked out of the police station, leaving behind a room full of officers who were just beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. The news broke 3 days later. A reporter from the local paper had somehow gotten wind of the story, and by Thursday morning, the headline read, Federal judge detained by police in alleged racial profiling incident. By noon, the story had been picked up by national outlets. Detective Ryan Blake sat in his kitchen, staring at his phone screen as notifications poured in. Facebook, Twitter, news apps. Everywhere he looked, people were discussing what had happened. Most of the comments weren't kind to him. His wife, Carol, sat across from him at their small breakfast table. She'd read the article twice, her expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. "Ryan," she said quietly, "tell me your side of what happened." He looked up from his phone. Carol had been a nurse for 15 years. She'd seen enough to know that there were always two sides to every story, but she also had a sense of fairness that had attracted him to her in the first place. "I got a call about a suspicious person," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "When I got there, I saw a woman who didn't seem to belong in the neighborhood. I was just doing my job. But she showed you identification, right? The article says she had a driver's license and registration." "Yeah, but—" Ryan stopped. How could he explain the feeling he'd had? The certainty that something wasn't right. How could he tell his wife that he'd looked at Angela Washington and seen a criminal instead of a respected judge? "But what? I don't know," he admitted. "Something just felt off." Carol studied his face. "Ryan, what exactly felt off? Was it the way she was dressed? The way she spoke? Or was it something else?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Ryan had been asking himself the same thing for 3 days, and he didn't like the answer he kept coming up with. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Internal Affairs had launched a formal investigation, and Ryan had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Sergeant Martinez had called him in for multiple interviews, each one more uncomfortable than the last. "Blake," Martinez said during their latest meeting, "I need you to help me understand something. Judge Washington provided valid identification. She provided vehicle registration. She told you she worked at the federal courthouse. Why didn't you verify her employment before arresting her?" Ryan had been over this question 100 times in his mind. "I tried to verify it, but she wouldn't give me specifics about her job." "Did you call the courthouse?" "No." "Did you ask for a supervisor? Did you run her name through any federal databases?" "No." Martinez leaned back in his chair. "So instead of taking 5 minutes to make a phone call that would have confirmed her identity, you decided to arrest a federal judge. I didn't know she was a federal judge. That's exactly the problem. Blake, you didn't know because you didn't bother to find out." The interview continued for another hour, covering every detail of the incident. Martinez's questions were professional but pointed, and Ryan could feel his career slipping away with each answer. Meanwhile, at the federal courthouse, Judge Washington was dealing with her own aftermath. Colleagues stopped by her chambers to express their support, but she could see the looks in their eyes, sympathy mixed with the uncomfortable recognition that what had happened to her could happen to anyone. Her clerk, Patricia, had fielded dozens of calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, and legal advocacy groups. Everyone wanted a statement, a comment, an interview. "Your Honor," Patricia said during one of their daily briefings, "the NAACP has asked if you'd consider speaking at their upcoming conference about police accountability." Angela considered this. She'd been a judge for 18 years, always careful to maintain the appearance of neutrality that her position required. But this incident had thrust her into a spotlight she hadn't sought. "What about the ACLU?" she asked. "They've also reached out. So has the National Bar Association and the Federal Judges Association." Angela rubbed her temples. She'd barely slept since the incident, replaying every moment in her mind, not just the arrest itself, but Ryan Blake's questions, his assumptions, the way he'd looked at her like she was lying even when she was telling the truth. "Patricia, have there been any similar incidents reported? Other cases of judges being profiled or arrested?" "I've found 3 cases in the past 5 years," Patricia said, consulting her notes. 2 state judges and 1 federal magistrate. All were people of color. The weight of that information settled on Angela like a heavy blanket. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a systemic problem that went far beyond one detective's poor judgment. At home that evening, Angela sat in her study, surrounded by law books and legal briefs. But tonight she wasn't preparing for court cases. She was researching her own rights, her options for how to respond to what had happened. Her daughter, Michelle, called from Los Angeles where she worked as a civil rights attorney. Mom, I've been thinking about this all week, Michelle said. You have to sue them. This can't go unanswered. I'm not sure a lawsuit is the right approach, honey. Why not? They violated your civil rights. They engaged in racial profiling. They falsely imprisoned you. Any lawyer would take this case in a heartbeat. Angela understood her daughter's anger. She felt it too, simmering just beneath the surface of her judicial composure. But she also understood the complexities involved. If I sue, it becomes about money, Angela said. It becomes about one judge getting a settlement. That doesn't address the bigger problem. Then what does? It was a good question, and Angela didn't have a good answer yet. Back at the police station, the investigation was revealing uncomfortable truths. Internal Affairs had reviewed Ryan's arrest record and found a troubling pattern. Over the past 5 years, he'd arrested African American suspects at a rate significantly higher than his colleagues. His use of force reports showed similar disparities. Chief of Police Barbara Chen called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. This incident has exposed serious problems in our department, she said, addressing the room full of sergeants and lieutenants. We're looking at potential federal civil rights violations, possible lawsuits, and a complete breakdown of community trust. What do we know about Blake's history? Asked Lieutenant Torres. Internal Affairs is still compiling the report, but the preliminary findings are concerning. This isn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It appears to be part of a pattern of behavior. The room was quiet as the implications sank in. A pattern of racial bias wasn't just a personnel problem. It was a legal liability that could cost the department millions and destroy years of community policing efforts. What about training? Asked Sergeant Martinez. When was the last time Blake completed bias awareness training? Chief Chen consulted her files. 3 years ago. And before you ask, he received satisfactory marks on all evaluations. That raised another uncomfortable question. If Blake's supervisors hadn't noticed the pattern, what did that say about the department's ability to identify and address bias among its officers? As the week progressed, the story continued to generate attention. Legal experts debated the incident on television. Civil rights leaders called for systemic police reform. Social media buzzed with hashtags and opinions. But for Angela Washington, the most difficult part wasn't the public attention. It was the private moments when she wondered if she'd been naive to believe that her position, her education, her reputation would protect her from the kind of treatment that so many others experienced every day. She thought about all the cases she'd presided over involving police misconduct, excessive force, racial profiling. She'd always tried to be fair, to consider the difficult job that police officers had to do. But now she understood in a way she hadn't before what it felt like to be on the other side of that equation. The question that kept her awake at night wasn't whether Ryan Blake would be punished for what he'd done. The question was whether anything would actually change, or if this would just become another news story that people talked about for a few days before moving on to something else. As she sat in her chambers, looking out at the city below, Angela Washington began to form a plan. Not for revenge, not for personal satisfaction, but for something more important. Real change that might prevent this from happening to someone else. 6 weeks after the incident, Judge Angela Washington sat in her chambers reviewing a proposal that had taken her weeks to develop. Instead of filing a traditional lawsuit, she'd worked with legal experts, community leaders, and police reform advocates to create something different, a comprehensive plan for accountability and change. The proposal sat on her desk, in a neat folder marked Restorative Justice Initiative. It outlined a path forward that focused not on punishment alone, but on education, community engagement, and systemic reform. Patricia knocked on her door. Your Honor, Chief Chen is here for your appointment. Send her in, please. Police Chief Barbara Chen entered the office looking tired but determined. She'd spent the past month dealing with the fallout from the incident, fielding calls from city officials, community groups, and federal oversight agencies. Chief Chen, thank you for coming, Angela said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in front of her desk. I wanted to discuss this situation in person, rather than through attorneys. I appreciate that. Your Honor, I want you to know that Detective Blake has been suspended pending the outcome of our investigation. Angela nodded. I'm aware of that. But I want to talk about something broader than just one officer's punishment. She handed Chief Chen a copy of her proposal. I've been thinking about how we can turn this incident into an opportunity for real change. Chief Chen opened the folder and began reading. The proposal was detailed and comprehensive. Instead of seeking monetary damages, Judge Washington was requesting a series of reforms. Mandatory bias training for all officers, community policing initiatives in neighborhoods of color, civilian oversight of police misconduct investigations, and a mentorship program pairing officers with community leaders. This is extensive, Chief Chen said. Change requires extensive effort, Angela replied. Chief, I could file a lawsuit and probably win a significant settlement, but money in my bank account doesn't prevent this from happening to someone else. What about Detective Blake? Angela had thought carefully about this. I want him to be part of the solution. Complete suspension of his duties, enrollment in an intensive bias awareness program, 100 hours of community service in predominantly African American neighborhoods, and mandatory counseling to address his unconscious biases. Chief Chen looked surprised. You don't want him fired? I want him educated. Firing him might feel satisfying, but it doesn't address the problem. It just moves it somewhere else. The meeting continued for over an hour as they discussed the details of implementation. Chief Chen was cautious but open to the ideas. She knew the department needed to rebuild trust with the community, and Angela's proposal offered a path forward that didn't involve federal intervention or expensive litigation. Meanwhile, Detective Ryan Blake was struggling with his own reckoning. The suspension had given him time to think, and the thinking hadn't been comfortable. He'd met with a counselor specializing in bias awareness, and the sessions were forcing him to confront truths about himself that he'd never acknowledged. Ryan, Dr. Martinez said during one of their weekly sessions, tell me about the moment you first saw Judge Washington. What went through your mind? Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I saw a black woman next to an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood, and I thought she didn't belong there. Based on what? I don't know. Just a feeling. But what created that feeling? Was it her behavior? Her appearance? Blake was quiet for a long time. No, he finally admitted. It was her race. I saw a black woman and I assumed she was up to something illegal. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, and the words felt like a confession. Dr. Martinez nodded encouragingly. That's an important recognition, Ryan. Now we can work on understanding where those assumptions come from and how to change them. The sessions continued, and gradually Blake began to understand the depth of his own biases. He learned about the history of racial profiling, the impact of unconscious bias on policing, and the damage that assumptions could cause to both individuals and communities. 3 months after the incident, the police department announced the implementation of Judge Washington's reform package. The announcement was made at a community meeting in the very neighborhood where Blake had arrested her. Angela stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included police officers, community leaders, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens. Ryan Blake sat in the back row, having been required to attend as part of his disciplinary agreement. Today we have an opportunity to turn a moment of injustice into a catalyst for lasting change, Angela began. What happened to me was wrong, but what matters now is how we respond to that wrong. She outlined the reform package, explaining each component and how it would be implemented. The audience listened intently, some skeptical, others hopeful. I want to be clear about something, Angela continued. This isn't about punishing good police officers. This is about helping all officers become better at serving all members of our community. After her speech, several community members approached the microphone to ask questions and offer comments. Some were angry, demanding harsher punishment for Blake. Others were supportive of the restorative approach. An elderly black man named Robert Johnson stood up slowly. Judge Washington, I've lived in this city for 70 years. I've seen a lot of promises about police reform come and go. How do we know this will be different? Angela considered the question carefully. Mr. Johnson, I can't guarantee that these reforms will solve every problem or prevent every incident. But I can promise you that they represent a real commitment to change, backed by concrete actions and measurable outcomes. She paused, looking around the room. And I can promise you that I'll be watching closely to make sure these commitments are kept. As the meeting concluded, Ryan Blake approached the front of the room. Angela was gathering her papers when she noticed him standing nearby. Judge Washington, he said quietly. Could I speak with you for a moment? Angela looked at him for the first time since that day at the police station. Blake looked different, older, more subdued. The arrogance she'd seen during her arrest had been replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Of course," she said. "I wanted to apologize," Blake began. "Not just for arresting you, but for the way I treated you. For the assumptions I made. For not listening when you tried to tell me who you were." Angela listened without interrupting. "The counseling sessions have helped me understand that this wasn't just about one bad day," Blake continued. "I've been carrying these biases for years, and they've affected how I do my job. I'm working to change that, but I know it's going to take time." "Change is always difficult," Angela said. "But it's possible if you're committed to doing the work." "I am committed, and I want you to know that I'll complete every requirement of the program you've designed. Not because I have to, but because I need to." Angela studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. What she saw was a man who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and was struggling to become better. "Detective Blake, I appreciate your apology, and I hope the work you're doing helps you become the kind of officer your community deserves." Blake nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "Judge Washington, thank you for giving me a chance to make this right instead of just destroying my career." "Everyone deserves a chance to grow and change," Angela replied. "What matters is what you do with that chance." A year later, the results of the reform initiative were showing promise. Use of force incidents had decreased by 30%. Community complaints about racial profiling had dropped significantly. The mentorship program had paired 40 officers with community leaders, creating relationships that were beginning to bridge long-standing divides. Ryan Blake had completed his community service and bias training. He'd been reassigned to a community policing unit where his job was to build relationships rather than make arrests. The work was different from anything he'd done before, but he found it more meaningful than he'd expected. At the annual Police Department Awards ceremony, Chief Chen stood before an audience of officers and their families. "This year has been challenging for our department," she said. "We've had to confront difficult truths about ourselves and our practices. But we've also seen what's possible when we commit to real change." She called Angela Washington to the stage to receive a special recognition award for her work in promoting police community relations. Judge Washington could have chosen to seek revenge for what happened to her, Chief Chen said. Instead, she chose to seek change. "Her vision and leadership have made us a better department and a better community." As Angela accepted the award, she looked out at the audience and saw Ryan Blake in the third row, applauding along with everyone else. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his face something she hadn't seen that day on Maple Street: respect. "Thank you," Angela said into the microphone. "But this award doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to everyone who chose to see this incident not as an ending, but as a beginning. Change is never easy, but it's always possible when we're willing to do the hard work of growth." As she left the stage, Angela reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The pain of that day at the police station hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into something constructive. Real change had happened, not because someone was punished, but because people were willing to learn and grow. It wasn't a perfect ending, because the work of building trust and fighting bias was never finished, but it was a hopeful one, pointing toward a future where incidents like hers might become impossible simply because people had learned to see each other more clearly.